Hello and welcome to another episode of the Undercurrent Stories podcast. I'm your host, Bob Wells. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by author, memoirist, teacher and founder of the London Lit Lab, Lily Dunn. Lily is author of Sins of My Father, a powerful and deeply moving memoir that explores her complex relationship with her father, a charismatic writer who abandoned his family to join the controversial Bhagwan movement in the 1970s. Through a blend of personal reflection, family history and cultural exploration, the book examines themes of love, loss, forgiveness, belonging and the lasting impact of childhood experiences. In this conversation, Lily shares the extraordinary story behind the memoir, discusses how writing helped her make sense of a difficult past, and offers fascinating insights into the craft of memoir writing itself. We also talk about family dynamics, memory, the ethics of writing about real people, and why everyone may have a memoir hidden within them. It's a thoughtful, honest and compelling discussion, and I'm sure you'll find it as fascinating as I did. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello Lily and welcome to Undercurrent Stories.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on. I was mentioning before we spoke, I read the book Sins of My Father, an excellent, well-written book, very, very compelling.
Thank you.
Before we talk about the book in a bit more detail, I normally ask guests if they could just tell us a bit about their life growing up and what made them become a writer. But what I was thinking on this one is you know, your life growing up was very much part of this book. So I was wondering if you just give people a little bit of a flavour of your life growing up and what the book Sins of My Father is about, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I grew up in the 70s in London, in Islington. I had both my parents were writers and also publishers, actually, at that time. My dad ran a small publishing company from our basement in our house. And then when I was 6, he met a stripper in a Soho club, and she introduced him to her guru, and he disappeared for 6 months and didn't tell us where he was or when he was going to come home. So that kind of was obviously a big sort of split in my sort of, you know, happy, seemingly happy family life. And then, you know, our lives sort of took on a different turn. But I stayed living with my mother in Islington and had quite a kind of, you know, normal, good upbringing, and then spent my summers with my dad in various communes around the world, wherever he was situated. And in terms of writing, because both my parents were writers, I think, you know, that sort of was obviously an obvious entryway into it. But I also came into it through as a means of kind of better understanding the feelings I was going through. You know, I think it was obviously a sort of complex thing that happened with my father, and it was something that I was very affected by. And it was actually my father who gave me my first journal when I was about 8 and said, you know, try writing down your feelings and see if that makes you feel better. And it did make me feel better. And so that sort of started my relationship with writing as a way of kind of working out and exorcising difficult feelings, but that also segued into writing stories, which I did from a very young age, and continued to do so up until I was a sort of teenager. So yeah, that was my entry into it. I loved writing. I was a big writer. I was more of a writer than a reader, actually, as a child.
Well, thank you for that. And having read the book, and I think I mentioned before we started, I read it in about 4 days. It was that compelling. I was drawn into your father. Also, it's about your father and your relationship with your father and what happened with the family. And one of the things that you mentioned fairly early on in the book was how your father was, at a very tender young age, sent away to a school. And I wondered how that affected some of the later sort of actions with him and what went on. What were your feelings on that?
Yeah, it was interesting writing Sins of My Father, because I obviously knew that my father had been sent to boarding school, and I knew that he'd been sent at a very young age. He was 7, so it was prep boarding school. And I knew that had been a traumatic experience for him, because he did talk about that quite openly. But I didn't really make the connection until I started to write the book into, you know, this sort of institutionalized way of life, and how that might have then led to him not only abandoning us as the family and sort of, being on this sort of crusade to try to find himself, try to find his home in various places, but always being slightly on the run, never really settling. But also sort of paradoxically, that the cult that he then got embroiled in 1979 and which was very much a part of his life probably for about 20 years after that, if not directly. He wasn't living in communes necessarily all that time, but he still had affiliation with it, was an institution. And so I found that very interesting to explore when I was researching the book, because I did a lot of reading about boarding school and what's now termed as boarding school syndrome, which is this sort of understanding of people who have been sent to boarding school, particularly when they're very young, have abandonment issues, have supposed sort of split personality between who they are at home and then who they are at school, and just these sort of means of survival, and how that could then be translated into something which just seems so overtly different from the boarding school experience, and particularly in my dad's case, it being it was the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh movement that was very prevalent and popular in the 80s, late 70s and 80s particularly. Obviously so overtly different, but of course it was also a closed group, and that there's perhaps sort of reassurance to somebody who's had that kind of schooling experience, where that there's a sort of, you're intimate but only so much, it's sort of diluted. They were sharing relationships with, there's a lot of sort of open relationships going on, and a kind of they were drawn to having relationships but also repelled from that kind of traditional intimacy of marriage. And actually, within the communes, marriage and close partnerships were driven apart. So yeah, I mean, I found that really interesting to sort of see that pattern in his life. And then, in the end of his life, when he ended up in this seaside town in California, where he ended up becoming an alcoholic, again, it was very strong on its community, but these were all kind of down and outs and people who slept in their cars. I mean, my father wasn't at that stage. He was living in a house, and he owned his own house at that point. But there was that sense again of kind of being something bigger than just being two people in a normal mundane life. My father was always drawn to the extraordinary. Yes. So yeah, I think it was an interesting process for me, and also very interesting that it came through the writing of the book.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that struck me while I was reading the book is that, having sort of gone to school in the 70s myself, there was this thing about, finding yourself and going to India. It seemed to be the zeitgeist at the time. And I just wonder how much of that had an impact.
Well, I think it definitely did, because that did seem to be a fashionable thing at the time. There was the Beatles were promoting that, weren't they, through their own guru, Maharishi, I think it was called. And there was obviously there was a lot more international travel. People were going much further into more exotic sort of climes through being able to travel on airplanes. So the world was opening up, and there was also this post-war generation of the parents who had been much more concerned with the immediate sort of, domestic sphere, and whether they had the right washing machine and, the right car and all of that sort of more close kind of concerns. And so I think my father's generation, certainly the boomer generation, a lot of them were reacting against that. And I think also, religion comes into it as well. There were a lot of people who'd grown up with Catholic parents, within quite kind of strict traditional rule-bound families, who then rebelled and wanted to let loose and sort of shake off all those shackles. There was very much that sense. Post-sexual revolution. I mean, there was so much going on at that time, which I think, you look at it now and you think that could never repeat itself now, no. I don't think.
No, it'd have to be several generations ahead, I think, if it started again.
Yeah, well, let's hope it doesn't. Yeah.
And the other thing that came out, was many things came out of the book. The other question I had was the experience of your father leaving and sort of taking on this lifestyle seemed to affect your mother, your brother, and yourself in very different ways. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, but I think that's inevitable, isn't it? And it's something that perhaps we don't think about until we start to do therapy, or you have a memoirist in the family, someone, or even a novelist in the family. Because if you're returning to the experiences of the past and somehow turning them on their head and looking at them in a new light, then you're going to be questioning what happened and comparing it to your siblings' experience, your mother's experience. In the case for us, I think my mother was just very keen to keep us close as a family. And I think, she absolutely succeeded in that. And she was a brilliant mother, and she was doing it on her own for much of the time. And she's also a very understanding and kind of naturally forgiving person. And so even though my father betrayed us and did some pretty terrible things, and he was a liar as well as a cheat to her, she was very careful not to turn me and my brother against him. And so she didn't criticize him openly to us, which, I think we've talked about over the years, whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. But I think what it did was it enabled me and my brother to work out our own feelings about him, rather than sort of dividing us or, making us choose between them. My brother, I think there's a real dynamic between fathers and daughters, which is something that I sort of played in with my father, and also it comes down to age as well. I mean, I was only 6, my brother was 8, perhaps he had more perspective on it. He kind of got what he could from our father, and he was sort of he allowed himself to be satisfied with that. Whereas I think I found it much harder, because I think there were emotional things that I needed from him that kind of left me in a slight state of pursuit. What also didn't help was that my father ended up marrying a woman who was 18 and I was only 10 at the time. And so, there was this sort of competitiveness, I think, that was established in that relationship, which was very complex because I really loved her and she was like a sister to me. But at the same time, he was insecure in that relationship. And so all his energy went into trying to keep her happy. And I was just sort of left as this child who he knew loved him. And so I didn't need that attention, whereas I obviously clearly did. So, there were kind of complex things that were very specific to my relationship with him, which I think was influenced by gender, by time that he left, by and also the specifics of personality as well.
Obviously, you were very, very young when all this happened. Life sort of carried on. You went to school and everything. I mean, did you think at the time this, I don't really like this, or how did you actually feel at the time? I mean, obviously, a lot of it you've been looking back at it with your memoir and before that. But as a child growing up through it, how did it feel?
Well, it felt really confusing, and I was very sad. And I mean, I remember my mum saying that that I was a very spirited young child and very confident. I was always I was 2 years younger than my brother, but he was always pushing me forward to do all the sort of talking, and if we went to the shops and stuff like that. So I was very confident as a young child. And then my mother always said that when my father left, that changed, and I became very quiet at school, and I started to get bullied, and I was then drawn to the stronger girls who then, sort of treated me badly. And so that went into a spiral of me not really being myself, I suppose. I just sort of retreated. And I do remember that, because I remember the sense in the playground of me kind of never really feeling like I had girls sort of, protecting me or looking out for me or being kind to me. And of course, when you're young, that can be a self-fulfilling situation. And in terms of my relationship with my father, I do also really remember particularly when he started to be with the woman who became his wife, where I was just deeply sad. So whenever he was living in London at the time because she was a lodger who moved into a communal house that he lived in. And I would spend my weekends there, and I would just cry and cry and cry. So there was this sense of sort of I was just deeply sad, and I didn't really know why, and I think I was just very hurt. And I suppose in a way there was a sense of grieving there happening that wasn't perhaps fully acknowledged by him. And so there was always this sense of me trying to get something from him that I couldn't quite grasp, I couldn't quite get, which, was a horrible sort of emotional state of it felt like neediness,
yes.
But actually from a child's perspective, I just simply needed my father to acknowledge what had happened.
Yeah. Throughout the book, it touches on some uncomfortable themes. I was wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, I mean, it's important to put this all into context, I think, and in no way making excuses for it. But what's been discovered since my upbringing, my experience has been that this inappropriate attention with young girls and also boys was rife within that particular cult. It was about sort of having multiple relationships. It was about following your impulses. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who was the guru, had these kind of crazy ideas, which, crazy or not, they came from somewhere. But, I don't know whether he intended people to actually sort of take this into practice. And there was a sense that men could take what they wanted, that there was a sort of freedom in relationships. I think a lot of older women, were also being abused to a certain degree. There was an inequality in the way that men and women were having these relationships. There was probably the men were kind of, leading quite a lot of that. So a lot of that's been revealed since. So, I mean, from my perspective, I was just a child, but because there was this atmosphere around the way that people behaved within the confines of the cult, the kids were very different from the children I was growing up with, because the kids who lived in the communes were around this all the time. And children replicate what they see, they copy what the adults are doing. So I was very intimidated by them when I would go and visit my father. And then when my father lived in a communal house in Italy, which was an amazing place in Tuscany, which I loved visiting. One of his friends groomed me from the age of 13. And because I was still in that state of sort of neediness for a father, because my father was so absent emotionally, I fell for it and needed his attention. I needed that, I needed to feel special and feel pretty and feel, so, that was a very kind of formative experience for me. That was a very sort of short-lived thing, because it only happened over a summer, and then it continued to happen a little bit back in London, in that I wanted to see him, and he gave me money to escape, leave school and run away and go and live with him in his camper van in Italy, some crazy fantasy. But then my mum found out about it, and it all abruptly finished, but it had its repercussions through my life. But it wasn't so much that, actually. It was more that my father knew about it and condoned it, and sort of saw it as a positive thing, that it might actually be a good thing for his daughter to learn through this older man, which, you look back on that, you just think, my God, that is so insane. And, this was sort of one of the central questions in my book as well, was how much of that was my father just being completely kind of lacking in self-awareness, or the nuances of the emotional needs of his daughter and what it means to be a father, and how much of it was he influenced by this greater idea in the cult, which this happened a lot in the therapeutic practice as well. You'd have the therapists sort of, taking it that step further and trying it on with the women participants. There was no sense of kind of moral boundaries. Anything like that was seen as something that you should transcend or provoke or overcome, rebel against.
It's incredibly brave talking about some of this stuff and the book. Does it sort of, when you talk about it on a podcast like this, or to people that you're teaching. Does it hurt? Is it painful for you?
No, not really. I think it's a strange thing when you write a book, because you spend a lot of time researching, thinking, writing, rewriting, editing, revising, going back over the same ground, but sort of differently. And also, there is that sense of crafting something and making it into a product, into something that you can then share, which what comes into it is that you're making an aesthetic book, something that is beautifully written, hopefully, and you're articulating your feelings in ways that are universal and can be understood by someone who's never had that experience. And I think through that, this is what I found certainly writing my book, and I've spoken to other memoirists, and they say a similar thing, that there's this sort of strange, it's not as simple as to say that it's cathartic, but there's a strange kind of separation that's happening in all of those processes, that the original experience can be very embedded in your psyche and in your behavior, when you carry these formative experiences around with you. But somehow kind of committing to writing about it helps you separate yourself from that. So, I went through that process for many years, probably from about kind of 2016 until the book was published in 2022. But then there was a secondary thing that happened, which is that because there was a big documentary on Netflix called Wild Wild Country that some people may have watched and be familiar with, which is about the cult that my dad was involved with. But the main thing that I took from watching that is that they didn't mention the children. They didn't mention how this cult had affected the children and the families that had been split from the religious sort of spiritual beliefs. And so another thing that came out of my book and me sort of, getting in touch with certain other young people who had been my age, a lot of them who had actually grown up in the communes, was that it felt like we needed to do another documentary in response to Wild Wild Country, which actually showed the experience of the children. Yeah. And that was made by a friend of mine called Marusha Perizonius, and that was also broadcast on ITV. And I think through also just, I didn't make that film, but I helped pitch it and place it with the production company. Just watching that process and seeing this platform for these other women and men to talk about their experiences was also incredibly, humbling and also, again, sort of part of that process of detaching yourself and letting it go. So, so much of it is actually about speaking about it and not being ashamed of it. And when you keep something secret, you're still sort of feeding into the shame that can surround things like that.
The other two themes I'd just like to sort of wrap up on the book, because I'd love to talk about the memoir side of things. Love and forgiveness. I detected there was still a huge amount of love running right through the book for your father. And despite everything, I thought that was quite incredible. Do you think that was particular to you and your family, or do you think from your experience of talking to other people that love continues regardless of what happens?
Good question. I think it was particular to our family to the point that my father, in a way, was a victim, in a sense. And that was part of what I came. He was a very lovable man, which was part of the problem, was that, he was never cruel. He never went out of his way to hurt people. Well, he did go out of his way to hurt people, but there was a sort of strange kind of naivety about him, almost, in that it's almost as if he couldn't quite get his head around how much he did hurt people. And, I put that down to, narcissistic personality disorder, which I think he had undiagnosed. And because there was a sort of a lack of, there was a kind of blankness where he couldn't take responsibility for his actions. And I think a lot of that was to do with guilt. and pain, damage, which, one could put down to the 7-year-old being abandoned on the steps of the boarding school, which was one of the threads that runs through the book. But interestingly, my editor, I was taken on by a very good editor at Weidenfeld and Nicholson, who pulled me up on that and said, because my initial draft of the memoir was called Starman. So, I really was putting him on a pedestal still when she brought the book, and she pulled me up on it and said, your readers might feel let down by this because actually there were actions that are unforgivable, and it was a really difficult conversation because it was like she was basically asking me to review my sort of feelings about my father. But she was absolutely right. And I think I needed to take one step back again and just see it from the reader's perspective. So part of the dynamic of how my relationship with my father had survived really right to the end, and that I was still there for him and I was still prepared to give up my life and my new husband and everything to try and save him, was because he always was in that position of being on a pedestal to me. That was important to him. And of course, it's a very narcissistic position to be in. You want to have people around you who adore you. And I played that role with him. So it was very interesting to be able to be given permission to step outside of that. I mean, obviously he had died by this point, so it was easier for me also to be able to kind of call the book Sins of My Father and have that other layer of actually saying, maybe I don't need to forgive you. Maybe I just need to accept that this is what happened and accept that actually maybe you're quite bad. You're not a bad person, but you were a bad dad, which is what I do come to towards the end. So I think it was important to me that I brought that journey into the writing, because that really is what the journey was for me. And it was only really through the writing and sharing it and having this feedback from the editor and then getting lots of feedback from my readers as well that kind of helped me see my father in a slightly different light. But yeah, just going back to your question, I think it's to do with my dad's temperament that there was still so much love, because he was very lovable, to do with our relationship, but also to do with the way I was raised. A lot of it is down to my mum being the compassionate person that she is. And I also believe if you write memoir, you don't write memoir to get revenge, to settle scores, to have a one-sided view against somebody who might have wronged you. You write memoir to try and understand and ask the right questions and be curious. And, the most faulted people can be the most vulnerable people. Yeah. And actually that's then where you've got really amazing, compelling characterization. So, those, in my view, those are the books that really work.
Did the book change you in any way after writing it?
Yeah, it certainly did. Yeah, it definitely changed me. I think it fundamentally changed my relationship with my father, in that even though he had died, I came to better understand him after he had died, because, I spent all this time sort of, it was difficult because by the time he died, he'd burned all his bridges. So there were very few people I could speak to about him. So I was sort of piecing things together through research, because he was a writer. So I had his manuscripts. I could read him through his writing, yes, which was great. But, I definitely got to understand him and know him better through the process of writing the book. So I think it changed me in that way. And it just sort of changed me, just, the fact that when you publish a book and it does well, and I had really good reviews, my teaching career really launched. And I think because it had such a fundamental sort of emotional impact on me, that really has fed into my teaching. I specialize in teaching memoir and mentoring memoir and helping people kind of find the strength to write those stories that are really difficult for them. So I think that's also changed me. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for talking about the book, which I thoroughly enjoyed and can thoroughly recommend. And we'll put the links in the show notes for the book. in terms of memoir writing, first of all, can we just define what a memoir is as opposed to an autobiography?
Yeah, so this is something that lots of people get tripped up on. How I define it is that an autobiography is the facts of a person's life. So you generally don't get an unknown like me writing an autobiography. You'll have someone who's famous writing an autobiography, or someone who's been very successful. And because it's only really people like that who the reader wants to know where they were born, what school they went to, what was the trajectory that sort of led to their success. So the autobiography is more the facts of somebody's life. It will most likely be told in a chronological order, whereas a memoir is much more thematic. So it's more that it's a story taken from. It's a story. The story part of it is really important. It's a story taken from a life rather than a life story. The other thing with memoir is that the word itself refers to memory. So it's not so much what you remember, it's how you remember, because obviously we know that our memories are quite fallible, they're unreliable. So as a memoirist, you're looking at your past, but from the subjective view of it being your past, your perception, with all its faults and its misremembering. So that kind of comes into it as well. But memoirs generally are thematic in that so in my case, it's a memoir about my father, about a daughter trying to capture and pin down a very elusive father. Or it might be an addiction memoir, or an abuse memoir, or a joyful gardening memoir. It can be any number of things, but they tend to have a common theme that binds it together.
And do you think all of us, and I'm talking for all our listeners here, do you think all of us have got a potential memoir in us?
I think so, absolutely. I think memoir is a very special form because it's a platform for what you might call the nobody. It's the ordinary person, because we all have extraordinary things that happen to us. And you can find the extraordinary in the smallness as well. It can be a philosophical memoir, or it's a sort of, sort of slowing down and giving the details of an everyday life. But, Virginia Woolf wrote brilliantly about sort of, walking across London to buy a pencil. But, she invites us into her internal world. And so, yes, I think everybody has a memoir in them. It's just whether they have the inclination or time or energy to spend on it. And also, memoir is quite niche still. I mean, people love it, but they tend, because there's this slight disjunct between people actually understanding what it is. I think a lot of people read memoirs like novels because a lot of them are written like novels and they don't realize that they are actually memoirs. So, it is still quite niche, and publishers are more likely to publish fiction, I think, because it's less risky. But, I think it's wonderful. I mean, the other thing with memoir is that it's a collection of your past, isn't it? So, and many people want to leave a legacy in some way to their grandchildren and have reflections on their life story and generations above them. And that can be a huge motivation for writing memoir.
I can imagine one of the reservations that people wanting to write a memoir about something, on some of the subjects that you wrote on in Sins of My Father, in other words, difficult personal subjects. I would imagine that you have to be quite brave, and it could put some people off. What would you say about that?
Well, it puts loads of people off.
Does it?
And I mean, yeah, that's the main, when I have people come to me and say that they want to, they have this internal kind of drive to write the story of their lives, or the story of their mother's life, or something that's happened to them that has followed them around. It haunts them. They can't let it go. They keep on thinking they mustn't write it because they're going to hurt so and so, and it will expose this and that, but they still can't let it go. And this is one of the most common problems that I have from people who come to me for help, to write their story. And I think, absolutely understandably, nobody wants a memoirist in the family. There are lots of things that people would prefer to have to be kept in the past and not brought. It's like a lot of people see it as sort of, hanging up your dirty laundry. What I would do to reassure people like that is that writing memoir, when you do it well, it's not like hanging up your dirty laundry, because actually you can write about a subject without exposing. I mean, obviously, there was no way that I could write about my father without exposing elements of his life. But there are choices that you're constantly making as a memoirist as to how much that specific thing needs to be in the book. Is this person actually a main character, or are they a periphery character? You can also write, particularly trauma can often be more powerful if you write around it rather than of it. You don't need to give all the details of horrific things that have happened to you. It can be more powerful to write it as an aftermath, for instance. So because you're looking at how we remember rather than what we remember, there are lots of kind of, satisfying ways of writing about difficult experience without it being too exposing.
Yes, and I should imagine, I don't know, but I should imagine when you wrote Sins of My Father, you didn't write everything.
No, I certainly didn't.
You had to sort of, not exactly censor it, but sort of distill down what you wanted to write and leave out parts that were less comfortable for you to write about, I guess.
Yeah, and you also have the whole issue of, what's legally, problematic. And I had a lawyer read my memoir, and there were, I didn't have to take anything out, but there were certain things that I had to navigate and, and change the wording slightly, and just, yeah. And I mean, I've spoken to many published memoirists who have had to, some who have actually had to take out sections of their books because of legal ramifications.
Yeah. I mean, let's say we've got, I'm just picking out a random example here. Let's say somebody had a particular difficult time through COVID and lost a couple of family members, and, they had 2 years of sheer hardship. And they feel, actually, there's a story here, because, there's stories about what the government were telling us every day and what happened with my father, let's say, and stuff like that. But it would make an interesting memoir. What would be the best way for them to start? Would they just sort of write bullet points as to various things? How would you? I mean, I guess that's probably what your courses do. Is it? What would you suggest to them?
Well, I mean, I would suggest that they write the first draft without really sharing any of it, and just sort of sit quietly with themselves to recall the story that they personally want to write, because the story that they want to write is going to be very different from what other members of their family how they might have perceived things. Yes. And so it's very important to do that in the privacy of and protection of your own space initially, not worrying too much about how people are going to perceive it, whether people are going to be happy with it. It's it's a very difficult thing to do, because, you can get absolutely tripped up by worry that, your sister's going to be down your throat saying it didn't happen like that, and you can't write that, and you can't, this and that. So you have to be very disciplined and try and shut off all those critical voices. And then once you know what the story is that you are writing, then I think and if it does implicate other people, because we are all entitled to our story, but our story merges with other people's. So there is a huge sense of responsibility that we have to their feelings. If we love them and we want to have a relationship with them, you have to be sensitive to people.
Yes.
It's just common sense. It's at that point that I would encourage people to then start to have those conversations with loved ones. And it can feel much more scary than it actually is, I think, in practice. I mean, obviously there are people who are going to be unhappy about it. And then, and then you've got that question of, okay, can I do this if they're unhappy? How can I do it and compromise? But I think generally, if people are involved in the process and they get to have veto, over things, I mean, you can check it at various stages. If you're unhappy with anything, you as the author decide what your parameters are.
Yes.
There's a very interesting book called The Art of Memoir by Mary Carr, and she came up with this idea that every writer of memoir should have their own individual code of practice, because everybody's going to approach it in a different way. And in the one of my final chapters in Into Being, which is a book I wrote on memoir, I interviewed a lot of memoir writers, and I was really struck by just how different people approach this very kind of sticky subject of ethics. Between giving Kit Duvall, who's a famous writer of fiction and memoir, gave all her siblings complete veto over what was included in her book, because she saw it as a sort of family memoir to that point, that she was writing for her siblings as well as herself. To another writer, Marina Benjamin, who saw it as solely her responsibility, what was put in. And also what was interesting from her perspective was that she would, if she was going to write in an honest way about a family member and include their faults and the things that weren't, as sort of, putting them in a good light, then she would treat herself in exactly the same way. So, yes. She comes across as a faulted human being as well, yeah. Which, is also our responsibility as characterizing ourselves. So I think the reason why it's so important to write that first draft is that you're not going to know what the story is going to be until you do that. And you're also not going to know how you feel about that until you've taken that step. So I think things start to take care of themselves to a certain degree.
Yes.
But I would definitely encourage people to invite people into the process of the writing at that stage.
I think that first part where you basically just plough ahead and write is very similar to what a lot of other authors I've had on the show have said. It is on that first draft, just get it down. Don't worry about punctuation and getting everything right. Just get the ideas down.
Yeah. Yeah.
You run the London Lit Lab. Could you tell us a bit about the London Lit Lab, please? How you can help people considering writing a memoir?
Yeah, so, it's just a small partnership that I've run with a friend of mine who's also a writer called Zoe Gilbert, and we've been doing it for the last 10 years. It's teaching. We started teaching in person years ago, and then COVID happened and we put everything online, and we now live quite far apart, so we continue online. But it's very much where I sort of do a lot of my teaching of memoir and mentoring memoir. I teach a very popular memoir writing course called Memoir Bootcamp, which I teach twice a year, and I do a lot of mentoring. And I also do quite a lot on my Substack as well, which I do like a monthly meetup for people who are writing memoirs, and they come and ask a question and we discuss it and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, you can find me in various places.
So the one that you do twice a year, is that online or is that in person?
It's online, but it's an intensive, long course. Like it's over 3 months. Sort of we meet every week online on Zoom, and it's a small group. It's 10 people. It's a kind of mini mentoring course, because I get a lot of mentoring inquiries and I can't take them all on. So I decided to put them all into a course, and it also means that people are supporting each other through their writing as well. So there's workshopping and teaching and one-to-ones with me, and then I have an agent come and talk to them, and so, various things that they get to have access to.
So does that include the fact that some of the people doing it might well be talking to each other at other times during the week?
Yes, they can. So we have a platform where they can chat as well, share things they're reading and events they go to and things like that.
Yeah. And you also teach at Bath University? Yeah,
I teach at Bath Spa University. I teach narrative nonfiction to third-year undergraduates there, and I also supervise the MA with sort of narrative nonfiction. Yeah. And
do you talk to many of those students who have successfully published memoirs?
I do. Well, yes. I mean, some of my students absolutely do go on to publish, and I'm also very much part of a network of published memoirists in terms of kind of supporting each other through various, things that we might want to write, or struggling to get our next books published, or just having that support network is so important, I think, in any writing. I mean, whether you're doing fiction or memoir, but it seems even more so with memoir, because it's such a personal, kind of contentious thing to kind of put your life out there. And the other thing is that Sins of My Father kind of emerged out of essays that I published before I published the book. And that, for me, was a really good way of testing the material, but also testing the readership. It was testing myself in terms of how I felt having certain more personal material out there, but also seeing how a readership responded to that. So that can be a good way into, sort of seeing whether your idea has legs,
yes,
in whether you can make it into a kind of universal enough subject to have people really interested to read it. Which is one of the biggest challenges with writing memoirs, is that sort of stepping from the individual and very personal into something that's going to be relevant to more people than just your family or your loved ones.
Making it marketable.
Making it marketable.
Thank you. Well, Lily, this has been such an interesting conversation. I think particularly after I read the book Sins of My Father, and you've gone into a bit more detail for listeners. Really interesting. Thank you ever so much for coming on. You can find links to Lily's books, including Sins of My Father and Into Being, as well as a link to her website on the show notes. Thank you for coming on the show, Lily.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.